Welcome to another episode of Defending the Line. I'm Kirsty Shepard, and this is my podcast to share the story of what happened in the murder of my cousin Debbie Carter in our small Oklahoma town, and how finding out the men convicted of that crime were innocent turned into a quest for truth and accountability. So I wanted to start this episode by somewhat of a disclaimer, in that this particular episode is one that I have dreaded doing. And it's because up until very recently, what I'm going to talk about today, I had not shared with anyone in my family. And we'll get to more of that. But, like many of you, I grew up believing that our criminal justice system was fair and balanced. And I guess I always believed that if you were arrested and charged with something, then you had some kind of connection to what had happened. I mean, we all see images like Lady of Justice with her blindfolded eyes holding the balancing scales. And that encompasses everything that our justice system promises us. Though throughout this process, I was learning that it wasn't Lady Justice who was blind. I was. I had this blind faith in a system that promises swift and certain justice. And I'd become very angry that Debbie had become lost in between the pages of these books and opinion pieces and editorials and newspaper articles. So much so that Debbie herself had become another piece of evidence in her own story. And my anger, coupled with the two failed attempts to pass a law in Debbie's name, the attending of the fourth trial, not to mention the prosecutor's obvious ill feelings towards me, really only made me want to learn more. Though the more I learned about Debbie's case, the less I felt like I knew. So I decided to reach out to someone who had been involved in the civil suit of Williamson and Fritz. And normally I would have been very uneasy about just cold calling a stranger. But I really had kind of developed this I don't give a shit attitude. And I was tired of feeling like I needed to ask permission. Needed to ask permission about what happened to her, or needing to ask permission about things that were public record. So I called this person up, and they were glad that I called, and we had a very open conversation. And I said, one of the things that really confuses and concerns me is this talk that the handprint they said was Debbie's isn't hers. So the first time that I had read about this was in Grisham's book. And this person that I was talking with pauses and kind of takes a deep breath and says, well, you're right. Our expert concluded that that was not Debbie's handprint. And so I'm like, so you're telling me digging up her body and putting my aunt through all this was just all BS? And so this person asked me, how far have you gotten with reading the testimony and the depositions? And at this time, I'd read bits and pieces. And they said, why don't you take a look at that? And that might help answer some of your questions. And I was really anxious about reading through them and wanted to get them to them as quickly as I could. So much so that I packed them up and threw them in a bag one weekend when my son had a baseball tournament. And so these inch-thick depositions are in my tote bag with hand warmers and sunflower seeds and all the things you need to sit at baseball tournament all day. And during the breaks, I would try to read through as much as I could. And so in these depositions, on a regular size sheet of paper, there are 4 pages of depositions. So I'm trying to read through this very small print and take notes. And, there was in the beginning, there was the general information questions and education, work history, all that kind of stuff. But it wasn't long until the questioning of this Agent Peters quickly turned to about his reversal on the opinion of whether or not it was or wasn't Debbie's handprint. And at first he seemed to skirt around the definition or the meaning of reverse. And that kind of frequently happens through these depositions. There's all this bantering back and forth about what, like the word important, what does or does that not exactly mean? Or, it's, anyway. So, again, so he kind of finally concedes that he did initially exclude Debbie from being the source of the print that was originally taken. And part of me wanted this to be untrue. I wanted there to be some kind of mistake. I wanted to continue to give them the benefit of the doubt, because I wanted to believe that Debbie's body being exhumed hadn't been in vain. So the handprint that was found on the wall in Debbie's apartment was labeled unidentified from May of 1983 to May of 1987. And this Agent Peters stated that during the exhumation, he didn't compare the prints to anyone but Debbie. And he was questioned about his conversations with the district attorney and with the OSBI agent Rogers. And he confirmed that there was no discussion of any other suspects besides Williamson and Fritz. So Peter seemed to recall that he was the one who brought up the possibility that the prints back in 1982 weren't good prints, and it could possibly be Debbie's. They could take a look at them again. But Detective Smith stated in his deposition that it was the DA who mentioned exhumation and that it was, quote, a loose end that Peterson needed to take care of. And so page after page following, the questionings on the points of identification in the print compared to the one in 1987 to the one in 1982. And I flipped back and forth in this testimony and, just trying to follow the dialogue on the ridges and trying to understand what they were talking about. And I remember at one point my focus shifted, that the ones that had been taken from Debbie, the handprints, that was this physical connection to her. That was something that she had left behind. And so, anyway, at one point I noticed there was a sharp shift in questioning of Agent Peters. And the questioning attorney began to ask him about the process used by his partner, a man by the name of Larry Mullins, to obtain the finger and palm impressions. And when I got to this part, I read Peter's answer, and I read it again and again. And I really probably this had been the thing that threw me the most of anything that I had come across yet. So Peters answered, I know that he had to, because again, remember, they're talking about the process of how they got these prints. So Peters answers, I know that he had the I think the hands were removed. But other than that, I didn't question him about it. So the line of questioning continued as to whether Debbie's hands were removed, who transported them from the medical examiner's office to the OSBI lab. From the answers that were given, it appeared that Mullins had made the decision to sever Debbie's hands to get better prints. And there was no report of a chain of custody. There was no report as to who was present during this act, who transported her hands from the medical examiner's office to the OSBI office, who was present during the reprint, who transported them back to the medical examiner's lab. There's none of that is reported. So the questioning attorney asked, is there any report, photograph, or other documentation where it is included in the file and has as its purpose establishing that the prints that were taken were indeed taken from hands that were attached to the body of Debbie Carter? And Peters answered, no, ma'am. So Peters tries to explain the details of Debbie's hands not making it into the official report. And he said he didn't really know why none of these details weren't there, other than it must have been to spare Miss Carter's family from more trauma. How thoughtful. So, again, I'm confused. How was none of this documented with the purpose of sparing Debbie's family more trauma? But none of this was documented in a report that we were likely to never see, and still have never seen to this day, because we aren't allowed to see what's in the OSBI file. So I tossed aside Agent Peters' deposition and began on his partner Mullins. And it followed about the same line of questioning. And so Peters and Mullins both concluded that the print left in the bedroom wall was Debbie's. But the stink of it was they didn't identify the same points that were supposed to be the identifiers of Debbie being the source of the handprint. And Glenn Gore's prints were never compared to the print on the wall until March of 1999. So the headline, and I mentioned this in a previous episode, the headline on March the 1st of 1999 said, "Murder investigation baffled police for almost 5 years. DNA tests could overturn conviction in Carter case." So that's the headline on March 1st. On March the 2nd, Gore's handprints were compared to the one on the wall. And it stated that there's no match. Then Gore's handprints are compared again in April of 1999, just a month later, just a few days after he turned himself back in from his escape. But the examination report, all these reports were done by Agent Peters. And he found there was no identification to Glenn Gore in any of these, which my thinking is not surprising. But why is he allowed to do all of these reports? He's the one that first said it wasn't her handprint. Then he says that it is her handprint. I feel like he would have some stock in saying that it wasn't Gore's handprint because initially he's not the one that compared it years ago. And he's said that it was Debbie's all those years ago. I just feel like there's a conflict there. And they talk throughout the depositions that they didn't talk to any kind of supervisor about this. I don't know, and that's what he testified to, but again, where is the oversight in any of this? I don't know. And crazy enough, these reports, so the report from March of 1999 and April of 1999 stating that that the prints were compared to Glenn Gore and that there was no match, these reports were CC'd to the Ada Police Department and the District Attorney's Office on March the 2nd of 1999 and on June 22nd of 1999. But later, in a deposition of the District Attorney in December of 2001, a couple years later, here's the line of questioning. So the questioning attorney says, what about his fingerprints? Talking about Gore's fingerprints. And District Attorney Peterson's answer is, I don't know of any fingerprints yet. Question, are you running those? And Peterson's answer is, well, I think that's part of our investigation, but that's not even relevant or material. But his office had received these reports already that it wasn't Gore's. But now he says that it's not material or relevant. So the fingerprint expert, again, in Williamson and Fritz's, stated that he believed that the print was not Debbie's. So throughout this, again, now I feel like I'm on a whole new learning curve. I need to understand more about this process of the prints. And so I began to contact handprint experts all over the country. And there were some that were very leery of talking to me, and others who, just kind of explained the process. But what I learned was that this procedure of removing the hands to get a better print source was pretty much standard practice, or a very well-known practice. And I cannot describe the level of anger and contempt that I felt toward all of those involved in Debbie's exhumation. I mean, how do you take the most painful human experience in a loss of a child, that they had taken that pain and made it so much worse? They made choices with no forethought as to how that might affect us. Or did they even care? Or maybe they thought we wouldn't find out. But as a result, they had made a dog and pony show out of my family's trauma and tragedy. So the sobering realization set in that everyone but us knew that Debbie was just a footnote in her own story. So you might imagine that I wanted them to be held accountable. I wanted all that I knew to be made public. And so I reached out to a family friend in search of an attorney. And I explained that I wanted a mean one. I wanted a bulldog. I wanted somebody who would get a hold of this and never let go. And so my friend gave me a couple of names who might be willing to do this. And what I wanted to do was bring a civil suit on behalf of Peppy for mental anguish. You know, the first day that Peppy ever spent in a mental hospital was just hours after she signed those papers to have Debbie exhumed. Now to find out, the strong possibility that it was all a lie. I thought I might have a case. And I didn't really want her to get any kind of money or anything like that. I mean, that would be great for her, but this was more about accountability. This was more about, I wanted badges. I wanted people to be disbarred. I wanted people to lose their pension. I wanted them to lose what Williamson and Fritz had lost. I wanted them to pay the consequences for what anybody else would be held accountable for if it were any other line of work. So I spoke with a gentleman who was willing to take the case. And he said, I explained everything that happened. And he said, Chrissy, I want you to have a full understanding of what you're up against. Prosecutors are, this is what he was telling me. So prosecutors are protected by law with absolute immunity. They're untouchable. Nowhere in this country has a prosecutor been successfully sued or held accountable for misconduct. I'm not saying it won't ever happen. There's always a first. But that could be a very long road, and you live in a very small town. He said, I'm not afraid of a good fight. And this will sure be one hell of one. So I want you to give some real thought to this, and you let me know. And I appreciated his honesty and his willing to fight a good fight. And I told him that I would take everything that he said into consideration, and I would make my decision. And over the next few days, the weight of what this attorney had told me really began to settle. And I didn't know, who the hell I was to think that I could actually make a difference, or who I thought I was for taking on something that no one else had ever done. So I just never called him back. So at this point, the book has come out, and I was invited to the annual Oklahoma Bar Association meeting that they were going to have a panel discussion called, and they called it Isolated Events or System Failure, a discussion of the Williamson and Fritz case. Now, on this panel was Oklahoma County District Attorney David Prater, the Pontotoc County Assistant District Attorney Chris Ross, the Pontotoc County District Attorney Bill Peterson, Williamson's attorney Mark Barrett, my friend from the Innocence Project Stephen Saloom, and myself. Grisham had declined the invitation because just a few days before this panel was to be seated, Bill Peterson had filed a civil suit for defamation from the book. And I had visited with Dennis Fritz, who also had been invited to take part in the panel, and he wanted to. But just a few days before, though, he had been advised to decline because he was also being listed as a plaintiff in this civil suit. So Fritz, Grisham, Barry Scheck and others were all listed as defendants in the civil suit that the district attorney had filed. He was alleging defamation of character and conspiracy for telling stories they told. So, yes, he was suing. One of the men he was suing was a man that he wrongfully convicted and sent to prison for 12 years for something he didn't do, and then is going to turn around and sue him for talking about it. So, back to the panel. So we all took our places on the stage in the, it was standing room only, and it was packed. And Oklahoma District Attorney David Prater and Ross and Peterson kind of were all sitting on one side of the podium, and myself and Stephen and Mark were kind of on the other. And I had brought Peppy with me, and she came and sat, right in front of me off the stage. And at one point, Peterson took the podium to present his view on how the prosecution of Williamson and Fritz, how all that came to be. And honestly, I thought he didn't look very well. I thought he looked tired, and you could really see the stress of all this. And so he kind of struck all the same points that he usually would hit. But one point that he mentioned about the testimony of someone else and why he couldn't use it because then it was hearsay. And right when he made this statement, and of course, it's an entire audience of Oklahoma attorneys. So when he makes this statement, I noticed that other attorneys start turning to one another, and you can hear them from the stage say, "No, it's not." And they're like, "Nuh-uh, what is he talking about?" I mean, I almost kind of felt bad for him. So he gets to the part of the exhumation. And like always, he talks about how they didn't get a good print in the beginning at the crime scene, and that justified needing another one, and so on and so forth. And then he says, and so when the handprints were redone, it turned out not to be her handprint. And I felt the look on my face, like I could feel my eyes bugging out of my head, and my mouth was wide open. And I turned my head and looked at Stephen, and I looked at Mark, and we were just kind of astonished. And then the assistant district attorney Ross reached up and tugged on Peterson's coattail and said, "You mean it wasn't her? You mean it was her handprint?" And Peterson quickly corrects himself, and he says, "I mean, it was her handprint. It was her handprint." And I remember kind of looking at Stephen, and I said, "Freudian slip?" And Stephen says, "I can't believe he just said that." And probably no one other than the people actually on the panel realized what he had said. And when the question and answering portion of the session came, and I was asked about the Justice Commission bill and what issues there were with getting that passed, the only thing that I could remember in my answer was hearing the anger in my voice. Because up to this point, I'd really, anytime talking to media or anything, I'd really tried to keep things positive and, reiterate that the commission wasn't about pointing the finger, placing blame. It was about understanding the causes of wrongful conviction in Oklahoma cases. But I could feel my anger just spewing over, or, beginning to. So when the session ended, There were several attorneys that approached me about offering support, and this included a gentleman who was going to be the incoming president of the Oklahoma Bar Association. And he handed me his card, and he said that, it was one of his top priorities to develop a justice commission through the Oklahoma Bar Association. And I think I'll always be disappointed that there was never a law bearing Debbie's name like I had intended for there to be. But by this point, I knew I was going to have to let go and trust someone else to take this on. And I tried to look at the issue, past my own wants and needs and, my own, past it just being about Debbie, and at least all the cases would be reviewed. And I had to hold on to the hope that good would come out of this. So just days before we had all participated in this panel, also Peterson had announced his retirement that was going to be effective January the 1st of 2008. So when there isn't an election and no one runs for the office of district attorney, that task then falls to the governor to appoint someone to that position. So initially in 1980, Peterson was appointed district attorney when the former district attorney won an election to become district judge. Now, with Peterson's retirement, we would have another appointed district attorney. So I really felt like the DAs were just, it's like we never voted. They were just appointed to the next one. And DAs are the gatekeepers to our criminal justice system. They have the awesome authority of getting to decide who is charged and what charges are brought against someone. Prosecutors are granted absolute immunity. No matter how they conduct themselves, they cannot be held civilly liable. And a prominent former prosecutor once said to me, who I have a great deal of admiration for, when we were talking about this little to no oversight, he said, "This is like leaving the rabbit in charge of the lettuce patch." This incredible unchecked power is held by district attorneys. Now that position and all that came with it would be handed over to the former assistant district attorney, Chris Ross. He'd been in Peterson's office for over 25 years. And now that baton would be tossed to him. So, in the next episode, we'll talk about what it would mean for me to stand in my own truth and the realization this issue of wrongful conviction and a broken system went way past only being about my family. So feel free to send in your questions again, and I'll do my best to answer those. And thank you so much for the sweet messages and the support. If you like this series, please do share and let others know so that we can grow the audience. That is my intent of doing this really at all, is to get the full story of what happened to Debbie out there. So you can go to defendingtheline.com for other information and updates, as well as Defending the Line on Instagram. We are also on Facebook. You can watch these episodes on YouTube at Defending the Line. And as always, I thank you for listening.